2:10 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026, the North Arabian Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln was not just launching aircraft, it was emptying its hangars into a sky that had suddenly turned hostile. Something had triggered a massive, uncoordinated scramble from 4 separate Iranian air bases, and the carrier strike group had only minutes to build a wall of steel in the air. The humid night air was thick with the smell of JP-5 jet fuel, and the low, rhythmic thrum of the carrier's 4 massive propellers pushing 100,000 tons of steel through the swells. On the flight deck, the only light came from the dim red glow of status boards and the blue-white tongues of flame licking out from the back of idling jet engines. Inside the orbit of an E-2 Delta Hawkeye circling at 25,000 feet, the radar screens were a chaotic swarm of yellow and green. The mission commander, a lieutenant commander with 15 years of experience, stared at the raw data streaming in from the AN/SPY-6 radar systems of the escorting destroyers. It was not a routine patrol or a localized violation of airspace. The digital track count was climbing rapidly. 5, 10, 18, 24. Finally, the count settled at 30. 30 Iranian interceptors were airborne and screaming toward the carrier strike group at supersonic speeds. They were coming from Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, flying in 3 distinct waves of 10 aircraft each. On the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the routine of night operations had vanished, replaced by the controlled violence of an emergency scramble. The shooters on catapults 1 and 2 crouched low, as the steam rose in white plumes from the deck tracks. An FA-18 Super Hornet, its wings heavy with AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, was taxied into position. The pilot, callsign Vandal, felt the airframe shudder as the engines went to full afterburner. The roar was not just a sound, it was a physical force that rattled the teeth of the sailors on the catwalks. With a sudden, chest-compressing jolt, the catapult fired. The 40,000-pound fighter was hurled into the black void at 160 knots, disappearing into the darkness for a split second before its navigation lights blinked into view as it climbed toward the intercept point. Below the flight deck, in the Combat Direction Center, the atmosphere was one of icy professionalism. The admiral in command of Carrier Strike Group 9 stood behind the tactical action officer, watching the 30 hostile tracks close the distance. They were less than 150 miles out. At their current speed, the first engagement would happen in under 6 minutes. The United States Navy had practiced for this for decades, but the sheer scale of the Iranian commitment was unprecedented. They were not just sending older 4 Phantoms or 5 Tigers. The radar signatures suggested a mix of modernized MiG-29 Fulcrums and 14 Tomcats, all carrying long-range anti-ship munitions. The primary objective was simple but absolute. No Iranian aircraft could be allowed to reach the launch basket for their cruise missiles. If even one of the 30 got through, the carrier would face a saturation attack that could overwhelm its close-in weapon systems. The admiral turned to his communications officer and gave the order that would change the course of the night. He authorized the use of all available air-to-air assets and cleared the rules of engagement. Any aircraft crossing the 30-mile exclusion zone with a hot radar lock was to be treated as a hostile target and engaged with intent to destroy. In the cockpits of the first 4 Super Hornets now screaming toward the first wave, the pilots adjusted their night vision goggles. The world outside the canopy was a grainy, monochromatic green. The head-up displays glowed with a steady, clinical light, showing the range to the nearest targets. The Iranian pilots were not turning back. They were accelerating. The silence on the radio was the most chilling part of the buildup. No warnings, no chatter, just the sound of heavy breathing and the faint electronic hum of the radar warning receivers. The 2 forces were closing at a combined speed of over 1,200 miles per hour. The first wave of 10 Iranian interceptors was now only 80 miles from the forward screen of the carrier strike group. The night was about to erupt, 2:25 in the morning. The airspace between the Iranian coastline and the USS Abraham Lincoln. The invisible war began before a single kinetic shot was fired. two EA-18 Golf Growlers, the specialized electronic attack aircraft of Electronic Attack Squadron 133, had reached their station at 35,000 feet. These aircraft were not carrying heavy bombs. Instead, they were laden with an ALQ-99 jamming pods and AGM-88 HARM missiles. Their mission was to tear the electromagnetic spectrum apart, turning the Iranian pilots' radar screens into a blizzard of white noise and false targets. The cockpit of the lead Growler was a cramped, high-tech sanctuary filled with the faint smell of ozone and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the pilot and the electronic warfare officer. In the backseat, the electronic warfare officer call sign glitched, watched the waterfall displays on his monitors. The Iranian ground-based early warning radars at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr were screaming at full power, trying to burn through the interference. It was a digital wrestling match, played out across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The Growlers projected massive cones of electromagnetic energy, specifically tuned to the frequencies used by the Iranian Mig-29 fulcrums and their ground controllers. By 2:30 in the morning, the electronic veil was fully deployed. To the 30 Iranian interceptors, the United States Carrier Strike Group had effectively vanished, replaced by a chaotic mess of ghost signatures and shifting interference. The Iranian ground controllers were forced to switch to backup frequencies, but every time they did, the Growlers' sophisticated systems tracked the change in milliseconds and smothered the new signal. This was the professional application of electronic dominance, a hallmark of the United States Navy's maritime strategy. The goal was not just to hide the carrier, but to induce panic and confusion in the enemy formation. 60 miles to the west of the Growlers, the E-2 Delta Hawkeye acted as the quarterback of the entire operation. Its massive rotating dome was a beacon of clarity in the digital fog. Using the cooperative engagement capability, the Hawkeye was sharing its crystal-clear radar picture with every Super Hornet in the air and every destroyer in the water. The United States pilots knew exactly where every Iranian aircraft was, down to the meter. While the Iranians were flying virtually blind, their radars useless and their radio communications reduced to static. The tactical advantage was overwhelming, but the sheer numbers on the other side still presented a lethal threat. The environment at this altitude was one of absolute isolation. Outside the cockpit glass, the stars were sharp and cold, reflected in the black mirror of the Arabian Sea 7 miles below. There was no sense of the massive fleet below or the dozens of missiles currently being readied for launch. There was only the green glow of the instruments and the constant, high-pitched whine of the jamming pods working at maximum capacity. The electronic warfare officer adjusted a dial, focusing a narrow beam of high-energy noise onto a specific Iranian radar site that was attempting to provide a mid-course update to the lead wave of interceptors. The signal on his screen flickered and then died. The admiral on the USS Abraham Lincoln watched the status of the electronic screen from the Combat Direction Center. The veil was holding, but the 30 Iranian aircraft were continuing their advance based on their last known vectors. They were disciplined, or perhaps desperate, maintaining their supersonic sprint despite the loss of their primary sensors. They were now 85 miles from the carrier. The time for the electronic war to transition into a kinetic one was approaching rapidly. The destroyers, USS Mason and USS Stockdale, positioned 20 miles ahead of the carrier, reported that their Mark 41 vertical launch systems were armed and ready. Inside the fighter cockpits, the pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 147 were receiving the target assignments directly from the Hawkeye. Each Super Hornet was assigned 3 specific targets from the first wave of 10. The digital links were seamless, transferring the coordinates and velocity of the hostile aircraft into the mission computers of the FA-18 fighters. The pilots did not need to use their own radars yet, which kept them electronically silent and difficult for the Iranians to detect. They were ghosts in the night, moving into the shadows behind the wall of noise created by the Growlers. The tension in the air was thick, a physical weight felt by every sailor from the engine rooms to the bridge. This was the second phase of a three-part plan to decapitate the Iranian air threat before it could get within 30 miles of the strike group. The electronic warfare assets had done their job. They had blinded the giant. Now, the hunters were moving in for the kill. The first wave of 10 Iranian Mig-29 fighters was now 70 miles out, their afterburners visible to the high-resolution infrared sensors of the hovering United States drones. The next 3 minutes would determine if the carrier's gamble would pay off. 2:35 in the morning, 40 miles ahead of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the lead flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 147 pushed their throttles forward, their engines whining as they climbed to 30,000 feet. The pilots were flying in a wide combat spread, each aircraft separated by 2 miles of pitch-black airspace to maximize their radar coverage and minimize the chance of a single Iranian missile finding more than one target. The cockpit was a world of vibrating metal and high-frequency electronic humming, the only light provided by the green glow of the night vision goggles strapped to the pilot's flight helmets. The lead pilot, call sign Vandal, adjusted the gain on his advanced targeting forward-looking infrared pod. On his right-hand multi-purpose display, the cold black of the sky was suddenly interrupted by 10 distinct white glows. These were the heat signatures of the first Iranian wave, the twin engines of the Mig-29 fulcrums burning bright against the background of space. At 45 miles, the resolution was sharp enough to see the external fuel tanks and the long, slender shapes of the air-to-air missiles hanging from their wing pylons. The Iranians were flying in a tight, aggressive formation, unaware that they were being watched through a high-definition thermal lens. The environment at this altitude was brutal and indifferent. Outside the pressurized canopy, the air temperature had plummeted to minus 40 degrees, and a thin layer of frost began to creep along the edges of the glass. The air was thin and crystal clear, allowing the stars above to shine with a piercing, unwavering light that reflected off the gray-painted wings of the Super Hornets. Below them, the Arabian Sea was an endless sheet of hammered lead, occasionally broken by the white crest of a breaking wave that lasted only a second before vanishing back into the dark. The smell of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic scent of the cockpit's cooling system filled Vandal's mask as he stabilized his breathing. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye, orbiting safely behind the fighter screen, whispered into the pilot's headsets. The voice was calm, a professional contrast to the lethal reality of the situation. The Iranian aircraft had officially crossed the commit line, a predetermined geographic coordinate 60 miles from the carrier strike group. By crossing this line while maintaining a high-speed intercept vector, they had met the criteria for hostile intent. There would be no more warnings. The mission commander on the Hawkeye gave the final CEST authorization. Argonaut flight, you are cleared to engage the first wave. Weapons free. Vandal switched his master arm to the arm position. On his head-up display, the green boxes surrounding the Iranian targets flashed and then turned into solid circles. The mission computer had already calculated the optimal firing solution for the 4 Super Hornets. Each pilot was assigned 2 specific targets to ensure no overlaps and no wasted ordnance. This was the sorting phase of the engagement, where the chaotic swarm of 30 hostile aircraft was broken down into manageable, individual problems to be solved with United States engineering and training. The Iranian pilots, still struggling with electronic noise being pumped into their cockpits by the Growlers, began to bank their aircraft in a desperate attempt to find a clear patch of sky. Their MiG-29 fulcrums were capable machines, but they were operating in a sensory vacuum. Their radar warning receivers were chirping inconsistently, unable to distinguish between the jamming and the actual targeting pulses of the American fighters. The gap between the 2 formations was closing at 20 miles every minute. The tension was a physical pressure in the cockpit, making the flight suit feel a size too small and the control stick feel like a living thing in the pilot's hand. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, The admiral watched the digital icons for the Super Hornets merge toward the icons for the Iranian interceptors. This was the professional kill chain in its final stage. The scouts had found the enemy, the electronic warfare assets had blinded them, and now the shooters were in the perch. Every sailor in the room was silent, their eyes fixed on the large screen displays. They were witnessing the start of the largest air-to-air engagement involving the United States Navy since the 20th century. The first wave of 10 Iranian jets was now 35 miles from the Argonauts. Vandal felt his heart rate settle into a steady, rhythmic thud. He pulled the trigger on the stick to the first detent, felt the electronic lock-on confirm, and then prepared to transition the night from a quiet patrol into a storm of fire and light. The long-range AIM-120 missiles were warm on their rails, their internal batteries activated, and their seeker heads searching for the targets already designated by the Hawkeye. The order of battle was set. The first wave was about to meet the full weight of Carrier Air Wing 7, 2:36 in the morning. The dark sky over the Arabian Sea was suddenly torn apart by 8 distinct streaks of white light. From the underwing stations of the 4 FA-18 Super Hornets, the first volley of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles dropped into the slipstream before their solid-fuel rocket motors ignited with a deafening, high-pitched roar. The cockpit of the lead fighter vibrated with the sudden release of weight, and, for a fraction of a second, the pilot's world was bleached white by the intense glare of the departing ordnance. Each missile accelerated instantly to 3 times the speed of sound, trailing a thin, corkscrewing ribbon of chemical smoke that hung in the cold, thin air. The environment within the missile engagement zone was a study in high-speed physics. The missiles climbed slightly to reach thinner air, conserving their kinetic energy for the final, terminal phase of the intercept. On the head-up display, Vandal watched the time-to-active timer count down. These missiles were fire and forget, meaning that once their internal active radar seekers turned on, they no longer required guidance from the parent aircraft. At 28 miles from the targets, the missile's internal radars snapped into life, bathing the lead Iranian Mig-29 fulcrums in a lethal, high-frequency pulse of energy that their primitive radar warning receivers could no longer ignore. The Iranian formation, which had been flying in a disciplined, tight wedge, suddenly shattered. The Iranian pilots, finally realizing they were being targeted by a superior force they could not see, began to execute desperate defensive maneuvers. They broke into pairs, diving toward the ocean and pumping out clouds of aluminum chaff and magnesium flares to confuse the incoming American seekers. The night was no longer black. It was punctuated by the brilliant, flickering light of decoy flares that burned at over 2,000 degrees, casting long, dancing shadows across the surface of the water 5 miles below. Despite the defensive efforts, the first wave of Iranian interceptors was caught in a professional, systematic trap. The United States missiles, guided by the precise data from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, ignored the decoys and the jamming. They adjusted their flight paths in milliseconds, their control fins biting into the thin air to maintain a lead pursuit intercept. In the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the tactical action officer reported the status of the engagement to the admiral. The digital icons for the first 8 missiles merged with the first 8 hostile tracks at coordinates 24 degrees north, 59 degrees east. The first impact occurred 40 miles out. An AIM-120 missile, traveling at over 2,000 miles per hour, punched through the starboard engine intake of the lead MiG-29. The resulting detonation of the 22-pound high-explosive warhead was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Iranian aircraft was not merely damaged, it was physically unmade. Its titanium airframe shredded into thousands of pieces of burning debris that tumbled toward the sea like a slow-motion waterfall of fire. 2 seconds later, 3 more missiles found their marks, turning the lead Iranian element into a graveyard of falling metal. The surviving Iranian pilots in the first wave were now in a state of total tactical collapse. Their radios were filled with the screams of their wingmen and the frantic, garbled instructions from their ground controllers at Bandar Abbas, who were still struggling to see. through the electronic noise of the Growlers. The Iranian formation had lost 4 aircraft in less than 15 seconds, and they had yet to see a single American fighter on their own radar screens. The air was thick with the smell of burning jet fuel and the invisible, ionized trail of the missile exhaust. Vandal and his flight of Super Hornets did not celebrate. They were already sorting the remaining Noman Saab 2 aircraft from the first wave, while simultaneously tracking the second wave of 10 Iranian interceptors that was now only 50 miles behind. The wreckage of the first. The professional rhythm of the carrier air wing was unrelenting. They were executing a pre-planned mow-the-grass strategy, systematically clearing each layer of the enemy's air defense before it could pose a threat to the carrier. The pilots checked their fuel states and missile counts, their hands moving with practiced ease across the cockpit consoles as they prepared for the next phase of the engagement. The first wave of 10 was now reduced to 6, and those survivors were scattered, fleeing in different directions to avoid the next inevitable volley. But there was no place to hide in the open sky. The second wave of 10 Iranian aircraft, consisting of older but heavily armed 4 Phantom interceptors, was now accelerating to supersonic speeds, closing the gap in a desperate attempt to overwhelm the American defenders by sheer volume. The night was halfway over, but the kinetic battle was only beginning to reach its peak intensity. The USS Abraham Lincoln turned further, into the wind, preparing to launch the remaining fighters of the alert force into the burning sky. 2:42 in the morning. The edge of the exclusion zone, 30 miles northwest of the carrier strike group. The air here was a freezing vacuum, thin and brittle at 20,000 feet, yet inside the cockpit of the lead FA-18 Super Hornet, the environment was stifling. Vandal felt the heavy pressure of his G-suit constricting his legs as he banked the 30-ton fighter into a sharp, 60-degree turn. The cockpit smelled of sweat, filtered oxygen, and the faint, hot dust scent of overclocked electronics. His world had shrunk to the green glow of his head-up display, and the frantic, heat-seeking logic of the AIM-9X Sidewinder missile currently slaved to his helmet-mounted sight. The first wave of Iranian interceptors had dissolved into a chaotic swarm of 6 surviving MiG-29 fulcrums, scattered and bleeding energy. They were no longer hunters. They were prey trying to claw their way back to the safety of the Iranian coast. But the United States pilots were not interested in a pursuit. They were there to sanitize the airspace. Vandal leveled his wings and felt the distinct, high-pitched growl of the Sidewinder's seeker head in his earpiece, indicating a solid infrared lock on the twin-engine exhaust of a retreating Iranian jet. The trigger was squeezed to the second detent. The AIM-9X Sidewinder missile shrieked off the starboard rail, a white-hot column of fire punching backward through the darkness. The heat blast washed across the fuselage, momentarily illuminating the gray paint of Vandal's wing in a hellish orange glare. The missile did not fly in a straight line. It swerved with predatory agility, its thrust vectoring nozzle snapping the nose toward the target. The solid fuel motor left a jagged, glowing scar across the sky that hung in the cold air for 5 full seconds. 4 miles ahead, the Iranian pilot saw the launch and reacted with the desperation of a man who knew his time was measured in heartbeats. He kicked the rudder hard left and pulled the stick into his lap, forcing the MiG-29 into a brutal 9G brake turn, while simultaneously dumping a frantic stream of magnesium flares. The bright, white orbs of the decoys tumbled into the dark, burning at over 2,000 degrees, momentarily bleaching the sky white. But the American missile's imaging infrared seeker was too sophisticated to be fooled. It ignored the flares, stayed locked on the specific thermal signature of the MiG's right engine, and adjusted its intercept path in a microsecond. The warhead punched straight through the titanium tail section of the MiG-29, detonating its annular blast fragmentation charge with surgical precision. The explosion was not a muffled bang, but a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the airframe of the nearby aircraft. The entire rear third of the Iranian fighter was instantly unmade. The twin vertical stabilizers were sheared off and sent spinning into the void. Like giant steel blades, a massive fireball erupted from the ruptured fuel cells, a sphere of orange and black that expanded to 30 meters in diameter, before the force of the slipstream tore it into a long, trailing ribbon of fire. The Iranian aircraft did not just crash, it disintegrated. The forward fuselage, robbed of its aerodynamic stability, began a violent, high-speed tumble that snapped the wings off at the roots. The pilot was thrown against the canopy glass by the centrifugal force, unable to reach the ejection handle as his world became a blur of spinning stars and burning debris. The wreckage was a rain of glowing titanium and aluminum fragments that scattered across 3 miles of open water, each piece hitting the surface of the Arabian Sea with a white splash that was visible even from 5 miles above. Dead silence fell on the tactical frequency for 3 seconds. The surviving 5 aircraft of the first wave immediately broke formation, their pilots abandoning any pretense of a mission as they dove for the wavetops in a frantic attempt to hide in the radar clutter of the sea surface. But the sky was already filling with the next wave of American reinforcements. Behind Vandal, the second flight of 4 Super Hornets was already rolling into their attack runs, their radars painting the second Iranian wave of 10-4 Phantoms that was now only 20 miles away. The immediate aftermath was a sky scarred by white smoke and the lingering, acrid smell of burning propellant. The radar screens in the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln showed 6 fewer hostile tracks. The first wave of the Iranian intercept force had been decapitated, reduced from 12 aircraft to 5 fleeing survivors in less than 10 minutes of sustained engagement. But as the first wave died, the second wave surged forward, their older but powerful radars finally burning through the electronic interference. The night was becoming a conveyor belt of targets, and the carrier air wing was just getting started. 2:45 in the morning. The destroyer USS Mason and the destroyer USS Stockdale were already leaning into the heavy swells of the Arabian Sea. The second wave of 10 Iranian 4 Phantoms had not waited for a visual engagement or a chance to dogfight. At a range of 40 miles, they had simultaneously released 20 K-100 and 2 anti-ship cruise missiles, creating a low-altitude swarm that was now skimming just 10 meters above the water. The air was thick with the smell of salt spray, and the ionized hum of the ANSPY-6 radar arrays working at maximum power. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the green glow of the Aegis combat system consoles reflected off the sweat-streaked faces of the tactical crew. The threat was no longer just in the air. It was screaming across the surface of the ocean at 500 miles per hour. These sea skimmers were designed to hide in the radar clutter of the waves, making them nearly invisible until they were less than 15 miles from their target. The tactical action officer on the USS Mason gripped the edge of his console, his eyes locked on the digital display. Vampire? Vampire. Vampire. He called out over the encrypted FleetNet. This was the signal that anti-ship missiles were inbound, and the fleet's defensive screen was now the primary line of effort. The professional response of the United States Navy was instantaneous and automated. The Aegis combat system, a miracle of computing power and sensor integration, began to prioritize the 20 incoming threats. It was not a human making the calculations now. It was a processor capable of tracking hundreds of targets and assigning 9, the most effective weapon, to each one. The deck of the USS Mason shuddered as the first of the Mark 41 vertical launch systems fired. A Standard Missile 2 erupted from the deck in a plume of white smoke and orange flame, its rocket motor clearing the superstructure. In less than a second, the environment on the deck was a chaotic symphony of mechanical violence. The sound of the launches was a series of sharp, chest-thumping cracks that echoed across the water. The smell of burnt propellant hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the metallic tang of the sea. 6 Standard Missile 2s were launched in rapid succession from the Mason, followed by 4 more from the Stockdale. These interceptors climbed high into the night sky before tipping over and diving toward the incoming Iranian cruise missiles like hawks stooping on their prey. 10 miles out, the first of the interceptions occurred. The Standard Missile 2s used their proximity fuzzes to detonate near the K-100 and 2 missiles. the sky was suddenly filled with brilliant white flashes that illuminated the whitecaps of the Arabian Sea for miles. Each detonation sent a cloud of tungsten shrapnel through the air, shredding the delicate guidance systems and fuel tanks of the Iranian missiles. 7 of the 20 incoming threats were neutralized in this first layer of the defensive screen, their wreckage tumbling into the dark water. But the Iranian swarm was persistent. 13 missiles remained, and they were now less than 8 miles from the destroyers. The Aegis system transitioned to the next layer of defense, the evolved Sea Sparrow missile. These shorter-range interceptors were launched in pairs, their smaller frames allowing for even faster reaction times. The Stockdale fired 8 of these missiles, their smoke trails weaving a complex web of white lines against the black sky. Another 8 Iranian missiles were turned into fireballs, the explosions so close now that the crews on the decks could feel the heat on their skin. 5 missiles had managed to leak through the first 2 layers of the screen. They were now less than 3 miles away, their seeker heads locked onto the massive radar signatures of the destroyers and the carrier behind them. This was the final, desperate stage of the engagement. The close-in weapon systems, the 20mm phalanx Gatling guns on both destroyers, snapped into life. These systems, known affectionately as R2-D2 with a bad attitude, began to rotate at thousands of rounds per minute. The sound was a continuous, mechanical scream that drowned out every other noise. A stream of armor-piercing tungsten tracers poured out of the barrels, creating a solid wall of lead in the path of the remaining missiles. The 4th and 5th Iranian missiles were literally stitched apart in mid-air by the volume of fire, their warheads detonating harmlessly 1,000 yards from the Mason's hull. The final missile, clipped by a single burst of 20mm fire, lost its guidance and cartwheeled into the sea, its impact creating a massive plume of white spray that washed over the Stockdale's forward deck. Silence returned to the outer screen, broken only by the sound of the wind and the cooling of the gun barrels. The 20-missile swarm had been completely neutralized without a single hit on a United States vessel. The admiral in the Combat Direction Center let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The defensive shield had held, but the cost in munitions was high. They had expended over 30 high-end interceptors in less than 4 minutes. The second wave of Iranian 4 Phantoms, seeing their entire missile strike disappear into the sea, began to bank hard toward the north. They were low on fuel and out of long-range weapons, but they were not out of danger. The Argonaut flight of Super Hornets was already rolling in behind them, their radars locked, and their pilots' fingers on the triggers. The night was not over, and the second wave of 30 was about to pay for their 2:55 in the morning. The northern reaches of the Persian Gulf and the airspace 60 miles north of the USS Abraham Lincoln. 18 Iranian aircraft, the final and largest element of the intercept force, were now diving from 30,000 feet in a coordinated, multi-vector swarm. This was the heavyweight punch the Iranian command had been holding in reserve, consisting of their remaining modernized 14 Tomcats and a dozen MiG-29 Fulcrums. The previous engagements had been localized skirmishes, but this was a massed assault, intended to saturate the American defenses through sheer volume. The night air at this altitude was a freezing, silent void, and inside the cockpits of the approaching strike, the only warmth came from the glowing green instruments and the frantic, rhythmic breathing of pilots, who had watched 20 of their comrades vanish from the radio nets in less than an hour. The environment within the Iranian cockpits was one of sensory overload and growing desperation. The pilots were flying in a wide, three-pronged arc, attempting to envelop the carrier strike group from the north, northeast, and northwest simultaneously. They had turned their own powerful NAWG-9 radars to maximum power, being projected by the American Growlers. Outside the canopy glass, the stars were cold and distant, offering no comfort to the men, flying toward a fleet they still could not see with their own eyes. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid and recycled air filled their masks as they accelerated to Mach 1.2, their afterburners carving twin sapphire blue scars through the darkness. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the Admiral watched the yellow icons on the main tactical display bloom like a deadly flower. The 18 new tracks were closing at a combined speed of over 1,500 miles per hour. They are trying to overwhelm the sorting process, the tactical action officer observed, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. They are breaking into 4 ship elements and diving to different altitudes. The Admiral did not hesitate. Launch the remaining Alert 5 and Alert 15 aircraft. I want a full cap combat air patrol, established at 40 miles. We do not let them get close enough to see the hull. On the flight deck, the scene was one of controlled, high-speed choreography. 4 additional FA-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 147 were already hooked into the catapults. The yellow shirts on deck moved with frantic precision, their wands cutting through the steam and darkness. Within 3 minutes, all 4 fighters were airborne. Their GE-414 engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. The carrier was now a hornet's nest, and the swarm was returning fire. The tactical situation was a complex 3-dimensional puzzle. The 18 Iranian aircraft were now less than 50 miles from the carrier's outer screen. At coordinates 25 degrees north, 58 degrees east, the first of the newly launched American fighters merged with the incoming swarm. This was no longer a long-range missile duel. It was becoming a chaotic, multi-aircraft melee. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye, orbiting at 30,000 feet, was working at its theoretical limit, assigning targets to 12 different Super Hornets simultaneously. The data links were a constant stream of binary code, transferring locks from the destroyers to the fighters and back again. The environment for the American pilots was one of intense, focused aggression. They were no longer flying silent. They had turned their own AN/APG-79 active electronically scanned array radars to high-intensity modes, bathing the sky in a lethal web of targeting pulses. The cockpit was filled with the discordant music of combat, the low growl of the Sidewinder seekers, the sharp chirp of incoming radar locks, and the calm, synthesized voice of the mission computer announcing fuel states and weapon counts. The smell of ozone and the physical strain of the G-suit were the only constants in a world that was moving too fast for the human eye to track without electronic aid. The Iranian 14 Tomcats, despite their age, were dangerous. They began ripple-firing their own long-range missiles, the trails of white smoke crisscrossing the sky like a spiderweb. One of the American Super Hornets, call sign Stinger, had to roll into a violent 7G brake turn to avoid an incoming Iranian missile that missed his tail by less than 200 meters. The heat from the passing missile was a momentary flash against the cockpit glass, a reminder of how thin the margin for error had become. As the two forces collided, the sky erupted in a series of flickering white lights as both sides began dumping flares and chaff. The 18 Iranian aircraft were now within 40 miles, and they were beginning to pay the price for their aggression. The American pilots, trained to operate in the most complex environments on Earth, began to pick the Iranian swarm apart from the edges. They were not just shooting, they were herding the enemy into kill zones where the destroyers USS Mason and USS Stockdale could assist with their long-range surface-to-air missiles. The night was reaching its breaking point. The 30 aircraft the Iranians had sent into the darkness were now being systematically reduced. But the final 18 were fighting with the tenacity of cornered animals. They were diving, climbing, and twisting through the cold. Arabian air, their engines pushed to the absolute limit of their design. The USS Abraham Lincoln turned hard to starboard, its wake a white scar on the Black Sea, as it prepared for the final, decisive minutes of the engagement. 2:58 in the morning, the sky 40 miles north of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The electronic war and the long-range missile duels had finally bled into the merge, the point where the speed of the aircraft and the lethality of the weapons meant that decisions were being made in fractions of a second. The final 18 Iranian aircraft were no longer a cohesive force. They had been shattered into small, desperate pockets of 2 and 3 aircraft, hunted by the 12 United States Super Hornets now prowling the darkness. The air was a chaotic graveyard of falling titanium and burning jet fuel, with the smell of scorched metal and ozone permeating the very fabric of the pilots' flight suits. The environment was a sensory nightmare. The sky was filled with the crisscrossing white lines of missile trails and the brilliant, blinding pulses of infrared decoys. Below, the Arabian Sea reflected the fires from above, looking like a mirror made of black glass, shattered by orange sparks. In the cockpit of his F-18 Super Hornet, Vandal felt the massive physical strain of the engagement. His neck muscles were corded with effort as he fought the 6G forces of a sustained turn. His eyes darting between the green symbology on his head-up display and the grainy, monochromatic world outside his canopy. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a component in a global-scale weapon system. His every move, guided by the silent, digital whispers of the Hawkeye overhead. The sorting process reached its final, brutal stage at coordinates 25 degrees north, 58 degrees east. The computer-generated target box on his display snapping onto a heavy signature. It was an Iranian 14 Tomcat, the largest and most dangerous of the remaining interceptors. The Tomcat was attempting to dive toward the water to escape a radar lock, its twin, engines glowing like two small suns on Vandal's infrared screen. The United States pilot did not hesitate. He felt the familiar, heavy vibration of the weapons system readying itself for the kill. The trigger was squeezed to the second detent. Two AIM-120 advanced, medium-range air-to-air missiles shrieked off the underwing rails in rapid succession, their solid fuel motors igniting with a violent, white-hot roar that momentarily bleached the cockpit into a world of pure light. The heat blast from the launches washed over the aircraft, a physical wave of energy that Vandal felt through the soles of his boots. The missiles streaked into the dark, their rocket motors leaving. Two jagged, glowing scars against the black sky as they accelerated to 3 times the speed of sound in less than 4 seconds. The first warhead punched straight through the Tomcat's left wing root, the 22-pound high-explosive charge detonating with surgical, terrifying efficiency. The structural failure was instantaneous. The massive wing, designed to sweep back and forth for supersonic flight, was sheared clean off. The fuselage, and sent spinning into the void like a giant burning blade. 1 second later, the second missile drove directly into the center-line fuel tank, the impact creating a massive, expanding sphere of orange and white fire that reached a diameter of 40 meters in a heartbeat. The explosion was so violent that it cracked the canopy glass of a nearby MiG-29, the pressure wave, slamming into the other Iranian pilot like a physical blow. The Iranian Tomcat did not simply fall, it disintegrated into a rain of molten metal. The forward cockpit section, containing the pilot and radar intercept officer, was thrown clear of the main fireball, tumbling end over end into the dark. There was no time for an ejection. The wreckage was a chaotic trail of burning debris that stretched for 2 miles across the sky before the largest pieces hit the surface of the Arabian Sea, with white plumes of spray that were visible even through the thickest smoke. The Iranian pilot in the trailing MiG-29, seeing his lead aircraft turned into a ghost in a single second, pulled his stick into his lap in a desperate vertical climb, but his energy was gone. He was a stationary target in a world of high-speed predators. Vandal didn't wait to watch the debris hit the water. He was already rolling his aircraft 180 degrees, his radar snapping onto the next target. Across the entire engagement zone, the story was the same. The 18 Iranian aircraft were being systematically erased from the tactical display. The United States pilots were operating with a cold, mechanical precision, each kill confirmed by the Hawkeye and recorded in the mission computers. The night of 30 Shadows was coming to its end, not with a whimper, but with the constant, rhythmic sound of missiles leaving rails and the silent, digital disappearance of hostile icons. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the silence was absolute. The Admiral watched as the last 2 yellow icons on the big board flickered and then turned into white X marks. The time was 3:04 in the morning. In less than 1 hour, 30 Iranian aircraft had been engaged, and 30 Iranian aircraft had been destroyed. The radar screen was suddenly, unnervingly clear. There were no more hostiles in the air. The only tracks remaining were the 12 United States Super Hornets, the 2 Growlers, and the single Hawkeye, all turning back toward the carrier. 3:15 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The North Arabian Sea. The violent crescendo of the air battle had faded into a haunting, electric silence that was almost more unsettling than the roar of the engines. Across a 60-mile swath of the ocean, the sky was no longer filled with the white-hot streaks of missiles, but with the drifting, cooling embers of 30 destroyed aircraft. The USS Abraham Lincoln was now turning back into the wind, not to launch more fighters, but to recover the exhausted crews of Carrier Air Wing 7. The air around the flight deck was heavy with the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and the sharp ozone tang of the carrier's massive radar arrays, still scanning the horizon for any sign of a follow-on strike. From the starboard side of the flight deck, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, call signs Knight Rider 1 and Knight Rider 2, lifted off into the darkness. Their mission was the most somber phase of any engagement: combat search and rescue. While the American pilots had remained unscathed, the Iranian intercept force had been obliterated, and international maritime law dictated a professional effort to recover any survivors from the water. The helicopters moved toward the last known coordinates of the largest debris fields, their powerful searchlights, cutting through the humid night air like white blades. Below them, the Arabian Sea was littered with the floating wreckage of Mig-29 Fulcrums and 14 Tomcats, the oil slicks calming the surface of the water into a shimmering, rainbow-colored mirror. The environment for the rescue crews was one of grim mechanical precision. The downwash from the helicopter rotors kicked up a fine mist of salt spray and jet fuel, creating a localized storm around each aircraft. The rescue swimmers, dressed in black neoprene and hovering just above the swells, looked for the telltale green glow of sea dye markers or the flicker of a strobe light. There were none. The speed of the American interceptions and the catastrophic nature of the missile impacts had left little room for successful ejections. The searchlights moved over floating sections of wings, shattered canopy glass, and empty life rafts that had deployed automatically upon impact. Back on the USS Abraham Lincoln, the first of the Super Hornets began to trap on the flight deck. Vandal brought his aircraft down the glide slope, his eyes fixed on the meatball of the optical landing system. The landing was a violent, jarring arrestment as the tailhook grabbed the number 3 wire, yanking 30-ton fighter from 150 knots to a dead stop in less than 2 seconds. As the canopy slid back, the humid, sea air rushed into the cockpit, smelling of salt and the heavy diesel exhaust of the carrier's tractors. Vandal climbed down the ladder, his legs shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump of the last 45 minutes. He did not look like a victor. He looked like a man who had just finished a grueling, high-stakes shift in a factory of death. In the Combat Direction Center, the damage assessment was being finalized. The Admiral stood before the master status board, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers written out in clear, professional English. The United States Navy had achieved its objective with 0 casualties and 0 aircraft lost. However, the cost in munitions was staggering. The fleet had expended 48 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, 12 AIM-9X Sidewinders, and over 30 Standard Missile-2 interceptors from the destroyers. It was a massive expenditure of high-end weaponry, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in ordnance used in turn lines a single hour of combat. The logistics officers were already coordinating with the supply ships of the Combat Logistics Force. The carrier strike group would need an immediate underway replenishment to bring its magazines back to full capacity. This was the unglamorous, essential side of naval warfare, the tech's constant flow of fuel, food, and missiles that kept the wall of steel standing. The Admiral knew that while they had won this night, the strategic ripple effects were only beginning. 30 aircraft was nearly a third of the regional Iranian air strength. The silence from the Iranian coastal stations was not peace. It was the silence of a command structure in total shock. By 4 in the morning, the last of the Super Hornets was safely tucked into the hangar bay. The brown shirts and red shirts moved among the aircraft, checking for battle damage, and beginning the process of rearming the jets for the morning's first combat air patrol. There was no cheering on the deck. The sailors moved with a quiet, somber efficiency, the weight of the night's events settling into their bones. They had executed their training perfectly, but the reality of 30 empty cockpits on the other side of the water was a heavy burden to carry. The search and rescue helicopters returned to the deck at 4:30, their fuel tanks nearly empty. They had recovered 0 survivors and only a few fragments of flight gear. The night of 30 shadows was over, leaving only the endless, indifferent waves of the Arabian Sea to cover the scars of the battle. The USS Abraham Lincoln maintained its steady course, its radar still spinning, its crew still watching, waiting for a sunrise that would reveal a changed geopolitical landscape. 5 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon of the North Arabian Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln was no longer a platform for kinetic violence, but a silent, professional witness to a fundamentally changed regional balance of power. The carrier's wake was a long, white scar on the dark water, stretching back toward the coordinates where, only hours before, 30 Iranian aircraft had attempted to challenge the sovereignty of the United States Navy. The air on the flight deck had cooled, the humid heat of the night replaced by a brisk morning breeze that carried a dusky, the faint, lingering scent of burnt JP-5 jet fuel, and the metallic tang of the sea. Inside the carrier's main briefing room, the atmosphere was one of clinical, exhausted professionalism. The pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 147, still wearing their olive drab flight suits and carrying their helmets, sat in tiered rows of high-backed chairs. There was no cheering and no celebratory shouting. Instead, there was the low hum of voices as they walked through the mission debrief, a step-by-step reconstruction of the engagement. Using digital flight data recorders and head-up display footage, the mission commander stood at the front, his face illuminated by the glow of a large screen showing the final tactical summary. The results were absolute and verified by multiple sensor platforms. Over the course of 90 minutes, the carrier air wing and its escorting destroyers had neutralized 30 hostile aircraft. The final tally included 12 MiG-29, Fulcrums, 8 4 Phantoms, and 10 14 Tomcats. Every single aircraft that had crossed the 30-mile exclusion zone had been destroyed. In addition to the manned aircraft, 20 SEAD-100 and 2 anti-ship cruise missiles had been intercepted and neutralized before they could reach the inner screen. The United States forces had suffered 0 losses of personnel or equipment. Every FA-18 Super Hornet that had launched was now safely chalked and chained on the deck or in the hangar bay. The tactical cost of the engagement was detailed in a secondary report for the Admiral. The carrier strike group had expended a massive volume of high-end munitions to achieve this result. The totals were written in the log: 48 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, 12 AIM-9X sidewinders, 32 Standard missile, 2 interceptors, and 16 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. Furthermore, the destroyers had fired over 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition from their close-in weapon systems. It was a logistical expenditure that would require the immediate arrival of a fast combat support ship to replenish the fleet's magazines. The United States Navy had proven it could win, but the price of that victory was measured in the rapid consumption of its most advanced technological assets. The strategic impact was already being felt across the globe. By 6 in the morning, the National Military Command Center in Washington, D.C. had been briefed, and the footage of the first intercepts was being prepared for release to international media. The message was clear. The United States Carrier Strike Group remained an impenetrable fortress, capable of managing a saturation attack from a near-peer regional adversary without taking a single hit. The professional application of electronic warfare, combined with the precision of the Aegis combat system and the skill of the carrier pilots, had effectively dismantled a significant portion of the Iranian tactical air force in a single night. Outside, the sun finally broke the horizon, spilling golden light across the flight deck. The yellow shirts and blue shirts were already back at work, conducting the morning's pre-flight inspections for the next scheduled combat air patrol. The carrier never flew, truly slept. Even after the most intense air-to-air engagement of the decade, the cycle of maintenance and readiness continued without interruption. The sailors on the catwalks looked out over the water, where the only sign of the night's carnage was a few distant, dark patches of oil that would be dissipated by the morning swells within hours. At coordinates 24 degrees north, 59 degrees east, the USS Abraham Lincoln maintained its steady patrol speed of 20 knots. The admiral stood on the bridge wing, his binoculars trained on the empty, northern sky. The night of 30 shadows had ended with a decisive American victory, but the professionalism of the United States Navy dictated that they remain at modified battle stations. They had won the engagement, but the mission of regional stability was far from over. The fleet was ready, its magazines being restocked, its pilots resting, and its sensors still searching the horizon for whatever might come with the new day.